Okay, well, congratulations on making it to quarterfinals. I'll introduce the panel. On my left is Team Robbie Pratt. On my right is the estimable Matt Tillman. And I'm Garth. And do you have anything to say? So keep to time, please. It's a conferral panel, not consensus, whatever that means. So I call this House to order, and I call upon the Prime Minister, Adam Chilton, to deliver the first constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 7 minutes. Here, there.
Thanks, everybody. So I like these guys. So I'm running a case that I've only ever ran in first round and in one final round. I think it's really open and interesting. So the Pueblo tribe in the southwest United States has a policy where you can only get public housing if you're part of the Pueblo religion. Now, there's very little housing on the Pueblo tribe. It's a poor reservation. So the impact of this is if someone converts to Christianity, they typically can't stay on the reservation and have to go elsewhere. So the U.S. government has the authority to intervene under the 1967 Civil Rights Act, but they don't have to intervene. It's not a rights violation if they don't. At least, the government isn't being compelled by the Supreme Court or anything else to intervene. The option's been left on the table, and the government's just dragged its feet, not making a decision about whether or not to intervene, and just simply say you have to give housing without discriminating based on religion or not. Simple off-choice question: should the government intervene? Assuming that they can do this perfectly, there's no discrimination.
Okay, just a couple of questions. So you said if they convert, they have to leave the reservation.
Pretty much, yes.
Is the public housing? It's just on the reservation, but provided by the government?
So it's provided by the tribal government on there. Now, the tribal government gets a lot of their funding from the U.S. federal government. It's important to remember. But yeah, so they have trailers, essentially. You get one of our trailers.
We're going to say...
Intervene, no.
Right. We're going to say don't intervene, that they should be able to have it on.
Okay, that's cool. So we're going to say this for 3 reasons. The first thing that we'd say is it's a justifiable violation of sovereignty. So the first thing that we'd say is that we need to create a theory of sovereignty, right? So we all agree that Indian reservations should have some rights to do what they wish, but we don't think that they should have unlimited rights. So instead, the theory of sovereignty that we propose is the one that the international community uses, which is that the sovereignty that any government should be given should be proportional to the rights violations that are occurring. Which is to say, if a government starts committing genocide, the international community is fine stripping them all of their sovereignty, right? If more minor rights violations are occurring, smaller sanctions, travel restrictions, things like this are allowed. What we'd say on our side of the house then, that if there's a rights violation occurring without an Indian reservation, that it's perfectly acceptable to say that the government can intervene in this case as long as it's a narrowly tailored response. So if Indians started widespread beating, we could take away all of their sovereignty. Much smaller things, we just need to know, thank you, a narrowly tailored response. We say that this is an incredibly narrowly tailored response, so we told you it just deals specifically with the problem. We still let them intervene in their other ways. But what we'd second tell you is that a rights violation actually is meaningfully occurring. So the first thing that we'd say is that you're violating both the freedom of religion and the freedom of consciousness, because you're actually having a discriminatory practice that discriminates based on religion. And you're also, that's the first rights violation. But secondly, it violates freedom of consciousness because you're trying to coerce people into a particular religion. So these people are thinking about converting, but they're forced with an impossible choice, which is go with the beliefs that I actually am coming to believe, or stick in my cultural homeland with my friends or my family. It violates their freedom of consciousness in this way. But third, it violates their rights as U.S. citizens. Remember, Native Americans have U.S. passports. They vote for U.S. congressional representatives, U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen. The Bill of Rights should apply to them, and as a consequence, it's a rights violation if it's the case that this is occurring to them. And we think that this way it's a rights violation that's occurring. Additionally, I think a rights violation is occurring as a fourth way, in which that they have a right to the common property of the Indian tribe, and essentially they're voting them off so they no longer have access to the benefits of being in the Indian tribe, or the common property. At this point, we'd say, since a rights violation is occurring, that you're justified in having a narrowly proportioned response. But secondly, we'd say on top of this, that there's good precedent for this, and that frequently Indian reservations are actually told that they don't have unlimited sovereignty. So states are allowed to say to Indian reservations what they can and can't do. So you know that some tribes have Indian reservations have casinos. So individual states don't have to let all of reservations have casinos. It's a state-by-state basis, and the government's held time and time again that the state of California or the state of Idaho is justified not letting its Indian tribes have casinos. They're additionally justified saying that there have to be particular speed limits. In other ways, the Supreme Court actually has intervened under the 1967 Rights Act to say that they have to elect tribal governments, that they can't exclude women from tribal governments, because they thought that was a violation of democratic rights. So there's good precedent for the government intervening anytime that you think a rights violation is occurring. And to say that these tribal reservations don't have the freedom to act differently than states, but instead they can act in the same way that the United States state can act, right? So the Navajo reservation in the United States doesn't have to be the same as Arizona, but it can't be different than any other state would be allowed to be, if that makes sense. And that's the precedent's been used, sure.
But there's also been a lot of good precedent about how Native Americans own this land in common and not individually. It doesn't seem like there's been a rights violation if no one's owning this land individually.
No, it's true that they own the land in common, but that doesn't mean that they have the right to vote off minority groups within that. It would be like terrible if they could say like, no women have land, no like kids have land, things like that over and over again, and voted them off the island, so to speak, because they disagreed with them. It would just allow for oppression of minority rights that's unacceptable. So the second point is that we say that we protect the entitlements of individual pueblos. That we say that there's three entitlements that they clearly deserve. The first is actually, strangely enough, the land held in common, which is to say that all of these individual pueblos have a right to a usage of that land. And as we said setting this up, they no longer get usage of that land if they're driven off the reservation, right? Which means I lose my like 1/60th piece of the land, so to speak. Even though if I don't have it to myself, I can't use that land in common. Secondly, you get tax breaks by being on the reservation, things like no sales tax and other benefits that come along with it. And third, you get free education and healthcare that the government provides that you have to be on the tribal reservation to get access to like the clinics and things like that that the government pays for. So these are all entitlements that individual pueblos get. We think that individual pueblos are owed these entitlements for three reasons. So first off, they are all part of the history of discrimination, which means their ancestors were discriminated against. And as a consequence, we think we owe them something for that, for their legacy of the Trail of Tears. Secondly, these individuals had poor upbringings themselves. So it's not just their ancestors were fucked, but they themselves, from the day they were born until now, have been slightly disadvantaged from being stuck on an Indian reservation. And as a consequence, they deserve the protection that should be afforded them so that they can't now be kicked off into the rest of society when they don't want to go, when they're not necessarily prepared to go into the rest of society, be forced to move to Albuquerque or Phoenix. And third, we'd say under this that there's a stigma against them once they go that makes it more difficult to get them jobs. And otherwise, they're still treated crappily for being a Pueblo, even if they have a different religion once they get to the rest of society. So there's no reason they shouldn't get the benefits of being a Pueblo. Now, well, here's what we tell you here, though. Those benefits, the tax breaks, the healthcare, the common land, are owed to each individual Pueblo. Not the abstract nation of the Pueblo tribe. It's not the Pueblo people that's owed benefits. It's all of these individual people that were wronged. This is where we have a different conception. We don't think the Pueblo tribe should be the one to get benefits, but each Pueblo person that was wronged individually. And here's what we'd say here, this is the argument that we're going to make, is that it's not acceptable for 51% of the population to vote off 49% of the population, and to keep all of the benefits for themselves. Because the system that they advocate allows them to hoard the resources that are US government resources that have been provided, which means that we actually have justification just vis-a-vis the fact that they're using our resources to violate these people's rights, right? It'd be one thing if they raised their money on their own and didn't want to give it to people, but they can't take US government resources and then vote it so that other people don't get it. The third and final argument is we'd say is that religion is not an essential part of the Pueblo identity for several reasons. The first off is that they possess many other common features that are more important, like language, history, and ethnic background. But secondly, if they leave, they're still treated as Pueblo. And third, they still self-identify as Pueblo and still want to stay on the reservation, despite often great personal costs associated with it. As a consequence, we don't think that individuals, you're out of order, should be allowed to kick people off, and we don't think that people should be allowed to self-define. There's two problems with self-defining. The first, it allows minority discrimination that we think is a problem, because anytime you allow a group to self-define, they can shave off the edges that they don't like. So we shouldn't allow a group to self-define when people meet the relevant criteria. But secondly, it actually kills culture in the long term. Because by self-defining in this way, you kill off cultural growth because you take the people that are being the most progressive, think the most differently from you, frequently the young people, and you send them away from the Pueblo tribe. This forces the Pueblo religion and the Pueblo tribe to be in cultural formaldehyde, so to speak, which is terrible for the long-term health of the tribe because you lose young people, reformers, and all of that associated with it. As a consequence, we think that you kill Pueblo religion for this criteria that they shouldn't be allowed to self-define out of, that you screw individual Pueblos, and that it's a justifiable violation of sovereignty because there's a rights violation occurring. For all of these reasons, we're proud to protest.
Here, here. I thank the speaker and I call upon the leader of opposition, Mike Riley, to deliver the next speech of the round onto his seat 8 minutes. Here, here.
Right, thanks very much, everybody. First, I'm going to go for an interesting case today for a good tournament. So I have 4 independent points I want to get into. The first is the idea of tribal freedom. So I think one thing that just really doesn't get addressed at all in cases, the special circumstance of Native American tribes in this country. There's lots of cases, although Adam gives a couple examples of how they sometimes have to conform to U.S. law, we can just point to the immediate example of this case of how they oftentimes also don't. So whenever he says, generally on case, look at all of these examples where they sometimes conform to law. Great, this isn't one of them, there's presumably a reason. And the reason we give them this kind of independence is specifically because they have a drastically different cultural background than anybody else in the United States. That the kind of system that Americans opted into by generally being from a European descent, not exclusively, but generally being from a democratic liberal background with a little L, those kind of people have generally consented to our kind of government, our type of laws, our type of cultural norms. Native Americans, for the most part, have not. So what we think is important is to allow them to keep their cultural traditions within our greater country. Maybe and sometimes we override those individual claims in some of the cases where Adam talked about. But lots of other cases, we let them continue to sort of do their own thing. For example, sentencing circles. They're basically able to provide sort of a criminal evaluation of the people within their own tribes. No thanks. Similarly, they can often just not go to state courts and go straight to the federal courts. We give them lots of sort of different ways to behave within our national system that other states and other localities simply don't have. They didn't really address that specific circumstance. It's a hard thing to weigh in the round, but I think what's important to ask is if we allow sometimes for them to sort of evade laws in terms of rights, things like sentencing circles, right? In their cases, they're able to determine punishments, not necessarily in line with how we determine other punishments. Is this case that much worse? And I think generally it didn't show that. But the second thing I want to talk about is the alternative if this person gets kicked off, and why I don't think it's actually a rights violation. Because it's a little weird that Adam sort of claims that it's a rights violation, even when in the case they sort of claim that there was no right to the housing. I understand the rights violation wasn't the right to the housing, but I want to talk about how it's really not that bad if he actually gets kicked off. So he still qualifies for public housing under the federal government, right? It's not like this person won't have anywhere to live. I agree that he might be stigmatized by his own tribe. He's presumably going to be embraced by the religion that he, takes as an alternative to the whatever religion that particular Native American tribes, right? He'd be embraced by that new religion. He'd still be providing public housing. So I think the federal government then has to ask itself what your right to housing, or really just the benefit of housing, I don't think anybody really claims a right to public housing, actually is. Whether it's to have public housing in a certain specific way that you want to have public housing or in a specific community, or just to generally have the sort of a baseline level of standard of living. And I think that's actually what it is, right? You don't say that you have to get public housing on like the Upper East Side of Manhattan. You have to say you have to get public housing to some degree. You have to have some kind of roof over your head. I think you're still going to get that, sure.
Okay, but if someone gets public housing in New York City, they still are somewhere in New York City. Don't you think that even if it's not as big a geographic difference, the cultural difference from being sent from a tribe to a major city like Phoenix or LA is huge?
Yeah, what's weird about that is it seems like this person's just rejecting the culture of the tribe, so I'm not sure that's really going to be that big of a concern. I think when they say that this person's just going to be, so ostracized and stigmatized, yeah, they probably are fully aware of that. When they rejected the tribes, basically the religion of a tribe and the culture of a tribe is very, very intertwined, right? They're basically the same kind of thing, largely because they didn't have a state developing separate from a religion. It was all one and the same. So given that, when they reject the religion, they're basically rejecting the entire culture and the entire state of that tribe. Given that, I don't think the person's going to say, oh God, I really feel offended that I have to move to a different city, because they already rejected the tribe that they came from. I don't think it's a problem. No thanks. The third thing that I want to talk about is how tribes conceive sort of tribal rights generally versus individual rights. Because I really don't think they conceive of individual rights in any way. And when you sort of apply this argument to the first one, I think this shows why even the religious claims aren't very important in this round. So tribes don't really have a conception that an individual has any claim to property. It's really a tribal claim to property, or really an individual right to religious autonomy. That's just not something that they conceive of. What that means then is they expect to a degree that everybody that's part of a tribe agrees with the tribe. If you disagree with the tribe, then you're probably not part of the tribe. I think if you look at the sort of variants of Native American tribes in the history of the U.S., many of them were very, very similar, right? But they actually were different tribes for very subtle differences across relatively similar geographic regions. The importance of that is people who had relatively similar conceptions of the war, even religiously, had slightly different conceptions and became different tribes. What that means then is that a tribe only has this sort of collective image of itself. So when it views property, it only says that our tribe has this property. I think when Adam says and tries to equate sort of the property rights to our sort of modern economic standard of an individual claim, that's just not something that enters their mind. I think the same thing occurs with religious liberties, and I think to impose those kind of rights, that envisionment of rights or envisioning of rights on these tribes is basically unfair, and it's just sort of imposing our current moral standards upon them. The fourth and final thing I want to talk about is the history and precedent, how this is going to be used, right? And this is sort of the practical implication for Native Americans, really, and everybody. Obviously, the U.S. pretty bad history with Native Americans, and I think what this basically does is say, look, you guys, we're giving you some leeway, but here's one way in which you just totally screw it up, and we have to override you, right? I think this is going to have two effects. One is for the tribe itself that's being overridden. They're likely to be pretty pissed off, right? So in cases where they can sort of work around the federal government, maybe they will try and open more casinos or things that the government's sort of ambivalent about. The exact harm that the tribe can do on the United States, I agree, is pretty marginal, but given this is a group that's been screwed over in the past, I'm not sure it's a group that should continue to be screwed over. I don't think the Native Americans have a ton of sort of backlash potential, but that doesn't mean we should screw them over. It means we should probably respect them. The reason they don't have tons of backlash potential is because we've been screwing them over for 200 years. Moreover, I think there's going to be a general public sentiment that this is just, especially in like the world from outsiders' perspectives, that this is just another step in that 200-year history of not respecting their culture, not respecting their traditions. Let's go back to case. The first thing that Adam talks about is a justifiable sovereignty violation. And we get this strange thing that it's okay if you have a proportional violation. So the first thing is just this, it's sort of predicated upon the fact that it's a rights violation to begin with, right? Adam basically says that you can only violate this sovereignty if it's a rights violation. The only right that he claims being violated is this religious freedom. Other things like the property right, I just don't think qualify here. But it's also just a strange standard for intervention for sovereignty, right? Because basically it means if some country has a really small problem, it's okay to intervene in a small way, which basically means you can always intervene and violate somebody's sovereignty all the time, right? Every country has some sort of minimal problem that we think would be violating somebody's rights. I think it's fair to say that every country in the world has this. But I wouldn't say, therefore, that you actually have a right to violate their sovereignty. I think a much more intelligent standard is you have to reach some sort of saturation point of rights violations before you can actually violate their sovereignty. I think that's far more intelligent, right? They have to actually meet some sort of threshold. Sorry, I'm running out of time. Before you can really get there. I think that's a better way to actually violate people's sovereignty. Then we get this argument about freedom of religion and sort of a whole bunch of things under it. The first thing I think is that you oftentimes regulate religion in order to have access to a location, right? Like, temples can kick people off for sort of not wearing yarmulkes, right? They have the right to do that. I don't think it's necessarily the same, but I think it's pretty close. You have a right to sort of regulate sort of the way people practice their religion within a given property. I think this is a similar case. Moreover, the United States has things like faith-based initiatives where they clearly say people can choose their religion and sort of dictate how education in that case is going to be run on a religious ground. It seems like if you do it for education, doing it for housing isn't a huge stretch. Then we get this issue about the common property claim. And I think this is just a different way than Native Americans actually conceive of it that way. I don't think they've decided it this way in the past, and I really think this is just imposing our sort of property rights construct on them. We get this next argument that some of them can't exclude women. I again think, even though we get this example, that's not really an argument. It's just saying maybe this could fit into some sort of construct, and maybe when we do this, half of the cases would allow their precedent, and half of the cases would allow ours. Not an actual argument. The second thing that they talked about is protecting the individual. We hear that the land's held in common and they won't get usage. I again think it's basically the same as the point above. That's just not how it's conceived. Then we get these actually, I think, pretty interesting arguments about tax breaks and all these benefits that people get. I think my response to this is we should change the way these benefits are given out, and they shouldn't be given out to the land. They should be given out to the individuals. So I think these benefits are different from the land, right? The land is conceived of differently in a collective fashion because it actually began with the Native Americans. They had the land in this collective fashion. Native Americans never conceived of tax breaks, so it's okay for us to impose our vision of individual rights on this because we envisioned tax breaks. The Native Americans didn't. So we should give these individuals them, even if they move off the land. Moreover, I think they're still going to be brought in by the religion that they're embracing, be it whatever, and they're going to embrace by that committee. The third and final thing, very quickly, is self-identifying as a Pueblo. They said they shouldn't be able to self-identify because it stagnates their culture. This is great, right? They're going to stagnate their culture on their own. But that's fine, right? If a culture chooses to sort of go in a certain direction and is stagnated itself, that's not a reason to intervene in that culture. I think it's better to say a culture should stagnate than to intervene in it and sort of change its direction. I don't think that's a responsibility of the federal government. I think this is basically just a throwaway point that can be added at the end of the case. We're proud to oppose.
Here, I thank the speaker, and I call upon the member of government, Grant May, to deliver the next speech of the round, not to exceed 8 minutes. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and members of the panel. Let me begin with this overview. The argument that Adam gives you in PMC is that these people are historically discriminated against, and it's each individual Pueblo who carries on this discrimination, right? Each of them have been equally affected by these problems. At that point, you have a debt to each individual Pueblo to facilitate their participation in their Pueblo society and to give them a leg up. That's why we give them these benefits. The analysis that he totally drops is the idea that we have an obligation to each individual, and it would be totally wrong to just pick and choose who you want to help and who you don't want to help. This is a huge drop throughout this case. I think it will win us the round. That said, going back on, going to his independent points, the first argument we get about is about tribal freedom. And he gives you this analysis where he's saying, look, what we would tell, we shouldn't intervene here because they have some degree of sovereignty. This is problematic in a number of ways. First of all, we would certainly intervene in other, so even in other countries, we don't give them unlimited sovereignty, right? We recognize that when Slobodan Milosevic is carrying out genocide, we are going to intervene in that situation. We don't recognize an absolute right to sovereignty, especially at the points where you have tremendous rights violations, right? And at that point, it's totally justified for the U.S. to go in. Moreover, what's particularly problematic for Mike in this case is that it's U.S. government money that's being used to perpetuate this rights violation. It's housing which is paid for by the U.S. government. At that point, the U.S. is complicit in this rights violation. The U.S. would certainly be justified in engaging in a narrowly tailored response, which is to pull out of its money and demand that these people be allowed to stay here. Moreover, we would also tell you is that tribal freedom is already limited in these ways. We wouldn't allow female genital mutilation on these tribes, right? We would not allow you to beat your wives or engage in illicit drug trading, right? We already recognize that it's there. What we would tell you is that there's not what they don't give you any bright line for determining what's okay and what's not okay. At that point, you have to say that certain things are not okay, and getting to the point where you're de facto kicking these people off of the reservation because they don't want to participate in the society is very problematic. It's a tremendous rights violation. They also give you this argument about, look, what we would tell you, they also say, well, look, it's okay because we owe this to these people, and we've given them this concession because we've harmed them in the past. What we would tell you is it's particularly pernicious because since you've harmed these people in the past, that you're then going to allow them to perpetuate harms against others in their society, right? The whole problem with the Trail of Tears, etc., was that we weren't giving political efficacy to minorities and we were denying them certain cognizable rights pursuant to the Constitution, right? We ignored Worcester versus the United States, Justice Marshall's famous opinion that Jackson said he simply wouldn't enforce. What would be particularly problematic here? Telling these minority pueblos that you don't have cognizable rights under the Constitution, we're just going to ignore it, right? This has very negative consequences for rights protections for these individuals. It's incredibly problematic. Now, the second argument he gives us, he's saying, look, it's not a rights violation because you could still get housing elsewhere, right? This is incredibly problematic because what we would tell you is that saying, well, look, you'll get a flat in Manhattan is not exactly a good alternative, right? If you're at the point where you've grown up all on some Indian reservation, saying that you can get housing in the middle of some metropolis is not going to cut it, right? You're not going to know what's going on in that society. In many cases, you haven't had all of the educational benefits that mainstream society individuals have had. This is very problematic. Going to a drastically different place where you don't know anyone, where you don't have any familial connections, is incredibly difficult for these people. Moreover, the second argument that's very important, no thank you, is that you have to recognize that these people could choose to leave if they wanted to, right? But they're choosing to stay, right? They want to stay in the society. They just don't want to practice the Pueblo religion. They've made a conscious choice to continue to stay, and at this point, the government, the tribal government and the U.S. government complicitly is forcing them to leave if they don't buy into this. This is incredibly problematic. What we would also tell you is that you can't control your community if you're not part of the society. At this point, you're away from all you know. This is a particularly pernicious situation for a discrete and insular minority, which is who these Pueblos are. The third argument we get about is about how tribes don't recognize individual rights. And what we would tell you is that the government still protects them from rights violations, right? Like, you can't discriminate against women. You can't deny them the franchise. Adam gives you all of these arguments about how the Supreme Court has already recognized that they have certain rights. We don't hear any response to this, right? We give you good arguments about precedent. Mike doesn't engage them at all. We've also told you that this is really strong cultural relativism here, and here's what's problematic, right? All Mike is giving you is engaging in a category error. He's saying that this is how these tribes are. That has nothing to do with this debate, which is about how these tribal governments ought to be, right? He's making merely a descriptive claim, which has nothing to do with the analytical reasons we've given him. Lastly, we give this fourth argument about history and precedent, and he says we have a bad history. The fact that before we have infringed on minority rights certainly doesn't justify continuing to do so, right? It certainly doesn't give the federal government a license to perpetuate harm. Moreover, we would also tell you is we owe them something because we've wronged them in the past, and we have to recognize that we have a debt to each individual Pueblo. It would would be totally unjustified for 51% of the Pueblos to vote 49% of them off of the society. At that point, they could just keep constricting the benefits to a smaller and smaller group. That's certainly unjustified.
Why is the debt to the individual and not the tribe when most of these people weren't even alive when the injustice occurred?
Well, nobody was alive when the Trail of Tears occurred, right? But we still recognize intergenerational debt, and we still recognize that if this group has been historically wrong, we don't have a right to pick and choose which people we're going to help and which people we're not going to help, right? We recognize that all of these people are members of the class, all of these people have a debt that we owe to their society, and we have to facilitate their continued participation in it. Going back on case, what we've told you is that this is a justified violation of sovereignty, and we give you arguments about how this is narrowly tailored, and we're making it proportional. The only response he gives you is how it's not a violation. We've made 3 claims about how this is a violation, which Mike doesn't bother to engage in at all, right? What we've told you is that you have a right to non-discrimination. You can't pick and choose. Moreover, we've also told you that these people are U.S. citizens, and they enjoy all of the rights protections pursuant to the U.S. Constitution, right? The Bill of Rights still applies to these people, as the Supreme Court has consistently held. Adam gives you this example from 1960s. They don't engage it. Moreover, we also give you this argument, and this is cold dropped, right, about a freedom of consciousness, right? The government can't force you can't coerce you into decision-making processes. The government can't coerce you into adopting a religion. What they tell you is that, look, it's not a violation. It's certainly a violation if your only choice is either to stay on the reservation and continue to enjoy all of the benefits there, all of the societal benefits there, or you de facto have to leave, right? This is incredibly problematic. They don't give you a good response. We give you this argument of precedent. They don't engage that either. Drop down to our second point, where we're talking about you have to protect the entitlements of individuals. We tell you that the land is held in common, right? So if you're thinking about it, each individual Pueblo owns 1/60th of the land, right? Has some participation in it, right? We also tell you that by virtue of living on these reservations, they don't get they get tax breaks, right? They get special education. They get special health care. Mike's only response is, well, look, you can still, let's just work out a way for how they're going to get this otherwise. What we would challenge them on side opposition is to tell us how you would get this, right? Like, how would you get to go to the special vocational school that's set up for your tribe if you're suddenly living in a flat in Manhattan, right? How would you get to not pay taxes, right? Moreover, we would also tell you is, how would you get all of this free schooling? How would you get to go to the special health clinic, which might be specially tailored to deal with Native American issues, right? If you're living hundreds of miles away, you're certainly not going to have these protections. They're certainly going to be disparate. You won't be entitled to all of this. Moreover, what we would also tell you is you have some certain right to live in the land where you grew up, right? Just saying that we'll give you a substitute isn't particularly good, especially at the point where we recognize a tremendous disparity between living in a metropolis and living on an Indian reservation, which you have a historical connection to. We also give you this idea about how they're historically discriminated, and we also give you a big drop, which is right that these people are stigmatized, right? Wherever they go, they're still identified as Pueblo, right? That's still their reference group, right? What's the problem with this? Since they'll be historically stigmatized by virtue of wherever else they go in society, government has to facilitate them in some way. Just saying, look, we'll give you a flat elsewhere isn't exactly going to cut it. Drop down to their other arguments where we told you, like, look, the 51% could not vote 49% off, right? And we're using government resources, right? You cannot have the U.S. government being complicit in this rights violation. They don't give you any response to this. This is a huge drop on their side of the house. We've also told you, as our third argument, that religion is not essential, right? And one of the worst things that can possibly happen to the society is when you get to the point where the society is allowing itself to self-define, right? And Adam gives you all of this analysis of how you don't want to be cutting people off at the edges, right? Because at that point, you have the most hardline members of that society deciding how they want to define themselves. What's the problem with this? All of the young people, all of the progressive people are forced to leave, right? They're de facto excluded from the society. At that point, you effectively put the society in cultural formaldehyde and wait for it to rot. You wait for it to decay. It doesn't grow in any way. You lose all of the young people. The society effectively extinguishes itself. What's the problem with this? If the whole purpose of Indian reservations are to preserve society, it seems particularly problematic for the U.S. government to be facilitating active disintegration of the society, right? What we would tell you is that these people have a right to stay there. If you're suddenly allowing these societies to kick off anybody who has disparate ideas, anybody who has more progressive values about how the society ought to exist, then you're effectively destroying that society. This is incredibly problematic. It goes against everything Indian reservations are supposed to stand for. Their case has fundamental problems. They don't engage many of our arguments with respect to this rights violation. We're very proud to have proposed.
Here, here.
The next speaker is called upon the member of opposition to deliver the next speech of the round. Here, here.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, for calling me up here today. Now, before the round, Riley told me it's going to be a contest between me and Grant as to who gets the floor in this round. I think after that speech, it's definitely Grant, because I thought it was incredibly surprising that the one argument that totally obviates everything he talked about in the MZ that Mike preempted in response to a POI by Adam was that these people have actually chosen to opt out of this particular system. By converting to another religion, they've accepted the consequences. They've recognized that this is the sort of consequences that they're going to get kicked out, but they decided to make that choice anyway. I think that insofar as that's the case, you're not going to be able to level these sorts of arguments that how we'll sort of like have this new stigma or how things will be particularly bad. Insofar as they've made that choice, and they've presumably made that choice with some degree of freedom, I don't think most of the harms they lay on our case are all that particularly pernicious. So that said, let's look to the overview that Grant gave us, because the first thing he talks about is historical discrimination, how we have a debt to each individual pueblo. I have a couple of responses. First of all, I think that a lot of what Mike talked about is how we should give these benefits to the pueblos, even though they're outside their reservation. If this means giving them things like school vouchers or giving them things like Medicare, that sort of thing is okay. I think that the only marginal benefits they'll claim is that, well, they have special clinics just for Native Americans built on the reservation. I think we're totally okay with subsidizing these people who leave the reservation with other sorts of things. Recognize that in the status quo, you only have to be a Native American to qualify for the law of the affirmative action benefits that sort of ethnicity entitles you to. I don't think that you have to live on the reservation. I think if they can caveat out that there's going to be no discrimination when they enact this policy, we should be able to caveat out that the U.S. will ensure benefits in a pretty good way. Secondly, on top of this, I want to point out that I don't think that these particular individuals were the ones harmed. They talked about how we have an obligation to each individual, but it was really the particular race or the particular ethnicity that was the one harm. And a pertinent example here is how we don't do individual sort of like reparations for slavery for each individual black citizen in the United States. Instead, we do affirmative action for the race as a whole. I think this situation is analogous. So let's look to Mike's first independent point, where he talks about tribal freedom, how we often allow them to non-conformity with respect to American laws. They talk about how it's important for us to intervene in other ways. He gives you the example of like Slobodan Milosevic and how we should intervene when genocide is being occurred. First of all, I would challenge whether that sort of magnitude of rights really applicable here. I think that what we try to argue is that there should be some sort of threshold where there's a continuing serious nature of rights violations. I don't think there's a lot of serious rights violations being perpetuated here. On top of this, they tell us that U.S. government money is being funneled into this sort of thing, and that's particularly bad. I think, first of all, recognize that the reason the U.S. money is being funneled, sponsoring these sorts of reservations is precisely because of this sort of past injustice, and we think that legitimates it. But on top of that, we think that this particular policy would destroy the exclusive nature of religion. One of the important aspects of religion is that it offers a sort of exclusive entrance into a specific community, and by destroying their ability to exclude non-members of the religion from the sort of culture that they've opted out of, we think that's particularly pernicious. On top of this, though, we recognize that the U.S. government supports all sorts of things like faith-based initiatives, school vouchers for religious schools, textbooks for religious schools. All these are examples where the U.S. government actually directly contributes to the success of a particular religion. No, thank you. On top of this, though, we say that states also have lots of police powers to enforce morals laws prohibiting the distribution of pornography or the consumption of alcohol. There are other examples of this. The point is that these things certainly are coercive with respect to a certain lifestyle, but states have the prerogative to do these sorts of things. I think the analogy is pertinent here, that Native Americans should have the prerogative to sort of enforce their own unique view of what's particularly moral, what's an appropriate lifestyle. The next point we get from Mike is the idea of how this isn't a rights violation, because they will still qualify for public housing elsewhere, because they'll be presumably embraced by their new religion. In response to this, we get the argument that, well, certain things are particularly bad, and this doesn't advocate for a strict right-line standard. Right. Recognize that we're an op, guys, so I don't think we have to have such a strong burden of proof. But on top of this, though, I think we do provide you with the standard when we're saying that's a serious accumulation of rights violations, not minor rights violations like in this case. Next, we get the argument that it's not going to be a whole lot of fun if they have to move to some sort of metropolis far away from where they live. I think that a lot of this is obviated by the argument I talked about earlier, insofar as they're actually choosing to opt out of this sort of society, then they presumably were willing to accept the consequences. They also talk about how these people won't be able to control their community, and that won't be able to control their community, and that's particularly bad. I think their plan fundamentally obviates the community's ability to control who stays in the community and who leaves. I think that's an important right of the community. Sure.
So all that you've done in this number 3 speech is keep saying that they chose to opt out. Doesn't it seem a little fucked up to say to someone, if you start believing in God, it means you're opting out being around your family and friends, even though that you're saying, I don't want to leave them?
Listen, Listen, first of all, I don't think that these people are, I think that these people are willing to make that sort of sacrifice, and that should be acceptable. But I also just don't think that these sorts of people are, going to be pushed so far away from the reservation. I think that most likely we can provide them with public housing relatively close to the reservation. I don't think we have to ship them from like wherever they are in New Mexico to Arizona. I don't think that's going to be as pernicious as you're talking about. The next point we get from Mike is the idea of sort of tribal versus individual rights. And we talk in response here from Graham, we get this sort of there's a lack of political efficacy here because we're not respecting minority rights. I think fundamentally what's not respecting minority rights is not respecting minority communities' abilities to choose where they want to live and who they want to be members of their community. I think ultimately we're destroying the tribal conception of rights by replacing it with an American conception of individual rights that isn't appropriate and isn't applicable, that fundamentally cuts across the grain of the Native Americans' conception of rights. They ultimately have a collective, communal nature of rights and crimes. I think this is the sort of thing we should respect above an American notion of individual rights. The next one we get under here is the notion of how this is sort of a category error because we're just saying what Native American cultures are, not what they should be. Right? Recognize that the whole point of having reservations is to promulgate some sort of cultural relativism by saying that these sorts of cultures should be allowed a degree of freedom in deciding what's right. I think that's not a category error. I think instead we're saying is that these sorts of people should be allowed to decide what's okay for their sort of lifestyle. The next one we get from Mike is that it's about history of precedent. Now, the U.S. has a particularly bad history. All we get from Grant is that, well, the U.S. also has a bad history of not respecting minority wishes. Right. This is exactly what they're proposing. They're proposing that the U.S. should, again, not respect minority wishes. What Mike tells you under here is that this is going to anger the tribe. It's also going to decrease the general public sentiment around the United States government because it's intervening, once again, furthering its precedence of involving itself in minority affairs when it really shouldn't be. So let's turn case study. Mike, in response to their first point, gives you the arguments about how the entirety of their first point is predicated on a rights violation, which I don't think that they've proven. Also under here, he talks about how this sort of standard they propose would always justify some sort of intervention. I think their bright line is actually not a bright line at all because it says that if there's even a smallest rights violation, then there's some justifiable abrogation of sovereignty. I think their bright line proposes way too much. I think alternative is much better. The next one we get under here is how we allow religions to regulate access all the time. In response to this, they say that we haven't. In response to this, we get the notion of how we need to respect people's freedom of conscience, freedom to make religious decisions. Recognize that laws that prohibit certain religious-based conduct are allowed under the status quo virtually all the time. Laws that prohibit prostitution cults or drug cults are permissible under their status quo. So we prohibit and restrict freedom of conscience in this way all the time. On top of this, though, recognize that the United States government subsidizes things like faith-based initiatives, like religious education, that clearly benefits certain religions, so taking therefore a non-neutral stance is this religious aspect. The next one we get is the notion of how sort of people have sort of rights to property, and that this entails that every pueblo has 1/60th of the land of the reservation. Again, I think this shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of Native American property rights, insofar as they don't actually conceive of themselves as owning 1/60th of the reservation, but rather the tribe owning the entirety of the reservation, and each member of the tribe having ownership only through the tribe. I don't think that this American notion of property rights is particularly applicable. Next under here we get but also on top of this, we get the notion again that we're not going to be able to sort of effectively counter these. We're not going to be able to effectively deal with these people because they're being shipped very far away. Listen, insofar as they sort of choose to do this, and insofar as I think we can do this in a relatively fair and equitable way, I don't think it's going to be that big of a problem. They reiterate their points again about how this is going to create a particularly big stigma, but recognize that they're going to have now a new group, whatever group they sort of chose to join instead of the Native American tribe, groups like the sort of Christian fundamentalists that they decided to join, that probably won't be stigmatizing them because they have joined them. Finally, with the argument on here that sort of it's particularly bad to allow these people to self-identify because religion is not essential. Right? I think that we get the argument on here that this is going to lead to the stagnation of religion because only sort of the elders or the hardlines are going to have a say in shaping society. I think this is pretty silly, right? I think generally in Native American cultures, pretty much everyone gets a say. That's why they have things like sentencing circles instead of trials with small elected officials. Sentencing circles in which the entire council of elders or which the entire tribe decides how punishments are decided. On top of this, recognize that they've chosen this mechanism, and I think it's fundamentally arrogant of the United States to say that this sort of mechanism is an appropriate way for these cultures to define how to actualize themselves. For all these reasons, we oppose.
Here. I thank the speaker and recall the leader of opposition to the limit of her meeting.
All right, thanks very much, everybody. I have 3 points of crystallization I want to get into. The first is the rights claim, because I think really the only way they can win this round is not just to show sort of whether it's good or bad, but whether there's actually a rights claim that overruns the sovereignty. So there's 2 issues of rights claims. I think a lot of the rights that Adam comes up with in PMC, Grant's totally right. I pretty much kind of dropped, because a lot of the rights just don't really exist, right? There's 2 main rights, the rights of consciousness and things like that. The main rights in this are the claim to the right of housing and the claim to the right of freedom of religion. So housing. I think they don't really try and claim that this is a right to begin with, but we still show that they're going to get it anyway, so I really don't think that's much of a problem. They don't really try to argue that this person has a right to the housing on the tribal lands to begin with, other than if it's a sort of violation of their right to religion. So I think it boils down to that. So basically, we have to weigh this against, one, you give a fair bit of leeway to tribes to begin with, right? They don't really actually respond to this. All Grant says is, remember all of those examples that Adam gave on case that Mike dropped? Yeah, you're right, I did. But again, what I did preempt is say, all of these examples doesn't prove that this case is the correct one, right? If we have all of these examples where we take away leeway, but in this case we let them keep leeway, it seems like in that case that we've made this kind of determination, that in some cases you give them leeway, and in some cases we don't. Because there's some examples on your side of the house, doesn't mean we never give them leeway. It in fact shows that it's a case-by-case determination, and we've determined that this kind of freedom in determining who should live on your lands is actually important enough. But moreover, we tell you that lots of regulations are allowed anyway. I tell you that sort of religious grounds are regulated in terms of wearing a yarmulke in a temple. Or just like living on a convent, right? It's an interesting example. If you decide that you're no longer going to be Catholic and you convert to Judaism, it seems reasonable for that convent to kick you off. That kind of regulation seems pretty reasonable to us. Regulating religious grounds, which basically these tribal lands are, is generally acceptable in the status quo. Seems like it should be. I really think the convent is pretty good. So the second thing is the conception of individual and tribe. And there's four ways in which this plays into the round. Land, the abuse, the culture, and the benefits. So I'm going to go through those. First is land. They never really argued, Grant never really argued in the speech, that land is actually conceived of as being held by a group, not being held as an individual. What's important here is you again apply this to sort of the housing claim, or the right that they have any right to this land to begin with, because I don't think they necessarily do. The only response that we get from Grant is further on about how all of these abuses were to the individuals, and something about the Trail of Tears, and don't we owe it to all of these individuals. The problem with this is we don't treat Trail of Tear victims any different than other Native Americans, right? What that means is we use the group as a proxy. We don't actually give individuals any great benefits. What's important here is that, one, that the harm actually probably occurred to the group, right? If society uses that group as a proxy, it's likely that the harm actually occurred to the group. Moreover, we tell you that most of these people weren't even actually alive, so it's hard to imagine that this harm actually occurred to the individuals. So each time Adam's going to say, but the individual has all of these rights. One, the tribe doesn't actually conceive of those individuals' rights, and two is, time and again, we seem to sort of give precedent to the fact that these tribes' abuses and sort of benefits should go to the group, not the individual. So next is the culture of religion, and I think this is important, because what I say in my LOC, and again gets dropped, if Grant's going to call me out on all these drops, I'll do the same, is the idea that the culture of the tribe and the religion is basically one and the same, right? That a tribe is brought up with this sort of religion and state all tied together, and when somebody rejects the religion of the tribe, I really do think they're just rejecting the tribe. The only sort of half response we get to this is, well, he wanted to live there anyway. Right, I still think he's rejecting the tribe. You might just like have friends there, right? I think when they reject the religion of the tribe, they're really rejecting the culture of the tribe. So when they say that it's so terrible that this person's being stigmatized from their tribe, all of those kind of harms, I don't think that's a problem. This person has chosen to reject that lifestyle. The fourth thing related to the individual and the tribe relationship is the benefits. And I think this is really important, because it seems like the only benefit we can't get in this round is the idea of sort of having housing on the tribe. But we get that pretty much by just going somewhere else, right? You can get public housing in some other city or in some other town in New Mexico. All of the other benefits, I think it's totally reasonable for Dave and I to say these people can get. Grant sort of says, well, how can you do that perfectly? I think Dave's response is, if they can caveat in perfect things, we can caveat in perfect things. It's absolutely fine. But moreover, it's just not clear why this is so difficult to do. Dave says you can get vocational training somewhere else. You can still get tax breaks, right? They send a check to a different address. It's not that difficult. These things aren't that hard to do. They can still get all of the benefits that actually are individual benefits. I drew a distinction in my LOC between land and the other benefits, right? Because land was something that the Native Americans had a conception of before, where tax breaks wasn't. So I think it's okay to follow the Native Americans' conception of land and trying to give them benefits there, but it's okay to follow sort of the U.S. government's conception of tax breaks and sort of economic rights when doing those new things the Native Americans didn't have a conception of. Third and final point is that of minority respect. So basically, pretty clear, heavily screwed over group. What this means is that we give them a lot of religious autonomy. I totally agree there's some cases where they don't, and there's some cases where we do. I think what this basically concedes is there's lots of cases where we allow those rights not to be as important. So basically, in weighing this round, you have to sort of marginalize the rights to begin with. They're not as important as U.S. citizens, because in lots of cases, we just don't value them to the same degree. The reason we do that, however, is not because we don't value the individuals. It's because we value the sovereignty and autonomy of these people. I think what I said in my LOC really didn't get responded to about how and when you violate sovereignty, right? Because what I said is that's a terrible standard, because you can just violate sovereignty anywhere, because every nation has some sort of violation of sovereignty. What you need is some sort of reasonable threshold of a higher violation that I don't think has been met here. But moreover, I think Grant really ends the round for us when he says the point of these reservations is to protect the culture of Native Americans, right? He tries to argue this in that last point about how you need to therefore end the stagnancy of the Native American culture. But if the point of these reservations is to protect the Native American culture, isn't that exactly what we're doing? We're letting the Native American culture exist without us interfering in it, without an American's conception of here's what Native American culture should be, and then protecting that on the reservations. I think there's a big argument here to be made about cultural relativism. I think we've made it pretty good here, that this group has been historically sort of screwed over in the past, and this would just be one more step in doing it. We're overriding their culture, not really for much of a right claim, and this isn't a group that traditionally gets respected for those rights to begin with. We're proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker, and I recall the Prime Minister for the final speech of the round. Here.
Thank you. I think there's first three questions. First, is a rights violation occurring? Secondly, if so, should sovereignty act as a shield to allow this? And third, what's best for the long-term preservation of Indians? So first, is a rights violation occurring? So Mike accurately points out that he dropped the ball. Then he dropped it again in the LOR. So he's like, they claim there's a right to housing, but that we recognize the right to housing isn't absolute. No. What we said is there's a right to non-discrimination in housing. Which is, once you decide to offer housing to someone, you can't discriminate based on religion. That's the right violation that we're saying is occurring. Here's a good way to think about this. Would any other state be allowed to have this practice? And that's what I'm going to prove to you right now. So first off, it's violating a discrimination practice that is a rights violation. That's very clear, that Mike never dealt with why they should be allowed to discriminate on the tribe. But when it gets to our second rights violation, when we said they are U.S. citizens with U.S. passports, U.S. voting rights, and the Bill of Rights applies to them. So a simple question, does it seem to violate the freedom of religion and non-discrimination of the Bill of Rights? I think it clearly does, and he never told us why it didn't, or why these people should be suddenly not treated as U.S. citizens, right? They can be drafted, they can serve jury duty, they're U.S. citizens. There's no reason, because they live in the Pueblo Reservation instead of Albuquerque, that their constitutional rights stop. But the third violation of rights that we said is the freedom of consciousness. And this is where Mike wants to be like, it's true that I dropped it, but in the LOR I'm just going to say it's not a right. Okay, so he never told us why it's not a right. What we said is that the government can't coerce you into taking a particular decision. Doesn't this seem clearly coercive to someone? So we don't really choose whether or not we start being religious. All of a sudden I start feeling Christian, right? It's incredibly coercive to say, if you want to go with that, you have to give up your friends, your family, your land held in common, all of these other rights, right? All that Dave tells us in his speech, throughout the whole MO, is, but they've opted out of the tribal system. No, they haven't opted out. If they opted out, they would go live in that other public housing that's available in Albuquerque that Mike told you about, right? That would be what opting out is looking like. What not outing out is looking like is saying that even though the rest of my tribe wants to kick me out, I still want to be here because I share the same language with them, the same cultural history. My ancestors died here. I have a right to be here. That's what freedom of consciousness they're violating. But they're secondly violating a whole set of rights that they have unique because they're Indians. We said that the common land is owed to all Indians, not just the majority of Indians, right? The majority can't vote out the minority and say that we get all of the common land. We secondly said the U.S. government gives them some amount of money, and that those people that are given the check can't say only 51% of us get the benefits of this check, right? They have to split it evenly because we told you it's U.S. money that's used to do this. That's a second rights violation that's occurred. And we also said that they get other benefits that are unique to being on the tribe, like the clinics and those sales tax. Mike said, look, they caveat on perfect application. Why can't we caveat on perfect application? I don't know where I caveated in perfect application on a side of house in terms of not violating rights, but I just don't understand how it's the case that they can still go to these free clinics or still pay no sales tax, right, if they move to Albuquerque. That's what we're saying just can't happen on their side of the house. So it seems clear to me that no state would be allowed to A, have this not discriminated practice A, right? But B, there's a second rights violation that's occurring because it's allowing 51% of the Indians to hoard and kick out 49% of the Indians, right? So there's two kinds of rights violations. The kind of rights violations you wouldn't be allowed to do to anyone in any state. And then the second set of rights violations that they're being fucked because they're Indians, right? And they're supposed to get benefits from being Indians. And they never told us why only 51% or 70% of the Indians should get all of these damn benefits, right? No good arguments against this. So the second question is, should sovereignty serve as a shield? So if this is fucked up, should sovereignty serve as a shield? They said that, first off, there's this threshold argument that you make, that you can't go in when there's a small rights violation, that you have to wait until it builds up. Grant made a good response here. He said, why do we have to allow minor rights violations to occur if we can have a narrowly tailored response? It would be fine if they said that our response isn't narrowly tailored and it would destroy the system of sovereignty, right? But we tell you, we can go in and really narrowly target this rights violation. That's why we don't topple a foreign government the second they have a minor rights violation. But if we can narrowly tailor it, just make it so they stop their one fucked up thing without having to go overly broad, it would be code. I specifically said our theory of sovereignty was a narrowly broad thing. But secondly, we said that we actually have precedent of going in the second a single rights violation occurs, right? In the United States, it's not the case that we just let Indian tribes rack up rights violations and then they get to some point where all right, rein it back in, guys, right? Instead, the Supreme Court, anytime they violate a constitutional right, and the way that they look at it is, the Indian tribes in Idaho can be different than Idaho. What they can't be, though, is different than any other state would be allowed to be, right? That's the theory of sovereignty that isn't allowed, and we allow the minorly tailored solutions. So that's why the sovereignty should be protected. Additionally, they gave you no bright line. On their side of the house, their theory of sovereignty would literally let tribes do whatever we wanted because we've wronged them in the past. Additionally, said the justification for tribal sovereignty is based on wronging them as a minority group, right? We fucked them when they were a minority, therefore now they can self-govern. But that right can't confer them the additional right to fuck minorities, right? Which is exactly what they're doing. So now the majority of the Indians are screwing the minority of Indians. But finally, what we say about the theory of sovereignty is, the theory of sovereignty is conferring the rights on the tribe. You shouldn't confer the rights on the tribe, you should confer them on the individual. We said because individuals have suffered. We gave 3 arguments. Mike only responded to the first, which is about this Trail of Tears history, right? But we also said each individual Indian had a worse upbringing because they were on the tribe, or they were brought up differently because they were on the tribe, A, right? And B, there's a stigma against them once they leave the tribe, which means that they're suffering from being a tribe, which means we owe them for their upbringing and we owe them for their stigma. The way that we pay them back from this is not forcing them when they have worse education and worse training to move to Albuquerque, right? That's why we say that we don't owe a debt to the abstract concept of pueblos. We owe each individual pueblo guy something, right? And what we don't owe them is the same sort of public housing that any of the rest of us would get, right? The second they're Christian, that they get the same benefits as me and Robbie Pratt, right? It shouldn't be that way. It should be they get something more. And the more that they get is that we say on your tribe, you're allowed to live there. Share the common land. Get the tax breaks. Get the educational benefits. And get to participate in the government. Final question, what's best for the long-term preservation of tribes? We told you that you shouldn't be allowed to self-define because it's horrible to let the majority vote off minority groups in any situation, and this is just an extension of this. There's no reason tribes should be different, A. B, we said they're actually killing culture in the long term. They said that we need to respect culture, and that we need to respect culture now. It's not respecting culture when you're allowing people to cut off the groups of the tribe that are the progressive, dynamic groups that would lead to the long-term health of the reservation system. They're killing the reservation system in the long term because they're getting rid of the young people, the people that are willing to change, and instead preserving the existing tribal leadership and letting them get rid of their enemies and the people that disagree with them. They dropped our arguments why we said that religion's not the most important thing, because we said they still self-identify as Pueblo, that they still want to be Pueblo, and that there's more important cultural aspects. This was the third point that they didn't address at all. As a consequence, you shouldn't allow them to self-define in this way. Look, we wouldn't let any state discriminate against its citizens in this way. There's no reason just to allow Indian tribes to do it because we wronged them in the past. That's only a justification to not wrong individual Pueblos. We're proud to propose.